January the 17th, 1945, Manila Bay, Philippine Islands. The harbor water gleamed like polished steel beneath a colorless dawn. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka Yoshio stood on the conning tower of submarine I-58, his binoculars trained on the distant American anchorage. The air tasted of salt and diesel exhaust, carrying with it the distant industrial symphony of machinery, a sound that had haunted Japanese naval officers for 3 years of brutal war. Through the morning haze, something impossible emerged, a structure so vast it seemed to defy the laws of physics and nature itself. It was not a ship. It was not an island. It was a floating dry dock designated AFDB-1, and it stretched across the water like a cathedral laid on its side, its steel walls rising 10 stories high, capable of swallowing an entire battleship within its mechanical embrace. Tanaka lowered his binoculars slowly, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of comprehension. He had spent 4 years at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy studying American industrial capacity. He had memorized the statistics, dismissed them as exaggerations, convinced himself that numbers on paper could not translate to reality. But here, in the grey waters of Manila Bay, reality mocked every assumption his nation had made about the enemy across the Pacific. The floating dry dock before him represented something more terrifying than any weapon. It represented an industrial philosophy so fundamentally different from Japan's own that the gap between the two nations could not be measured in mere production figures. It had to be measured in worlds. The war in the Pacific had been predicated on a single, catastrophic miscalculation. When Admiral Yamato Isoroku planned the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, he understood that Japan could not outproduce the United States in a prolonged conflict. His strategy depended on a swift, decisive blow that would cripple American naval power and force a negotiated peace before the sleeping giant of American industry could awaken. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve," he allegedly remarked after Pearl Harbor, though the authenticity of those words remains debated among historians. What cannot be debated is that his fear proved prophetic. The giant did not simply awaken. It rose with a fury of productivity that rewrote the rules of industrial warfare. By 1945, Japanese engineers and naval commanders had witnessed the impossible made routine. American submarines prowled Japanese shipping lanes with impunity, resupplied by massive tender ships that carried entire machine shops within their hulls. American carriers, once believed to require months of repair after battle damage, returned to combat within weeks. American battleships struck by kamikaze aircraft limped to forward bases and emerged days later, fully repaired, their crews rested, and their magazines restocked. The secret behind this miraculous resilience was not courage or superior tactics. It was something the Japanese military mind had never fully comprehended: the absolute supremacy of logistics over valor and the revolutionary concept of the floating dry dock. Traditional dry docks were carved from solid earth, their massive gates built into harbors that took years to construct and decades to establish. They were strategic assets, precious and vulnerable, requiring enormous investment in infrastructure and labor. The Americans had such docks, certainly. The massive facilities at Pearl Harbor, Norfolk, and Puget Sound represented the pinnacle of pre-war naval engineering. But the Americans had done something no other nation had seriously attempted. They had made the dry dock itself mobile. They had taken one of the most fundamental requirements of naval warfare, the ability to repair damaged ships, and transformed it into a deployable asset that could follow the fleet across thousands of miles of ocean. The concept seemed simple in retrospect, as revolutionary ideas often do. If a ship could float, why couldn't a dock? But the engineering challenges were staggering. A floating dry dock had to be strong enough to lift ships displacing tens of thousands of tons, stable enough to remain level in open ocean, and modular enough to be transported in sections and assembled at forward bases. It required precision welding on a scale never before attempted, ballast systems of extraordinary complexity, and structural engineering that pushed the boundaries of 1940s metallurgy. Most nations would have deemed such a project too expensive, too risky, too experimental. The United States built them by the dozen. Japanese naval intelligence had tracked the construction of these floating fortresses with growing alarm. The reports seemed fantastical. Dry dock sections fabricated in landlocked cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh, transported by rail to coastal assembly points, welded together into structures larger than most Japanese shipyards, then towed thousands of miles across the Pacific to forward bases in Ulithi, Guam, and the Philippines. Each dock represented approximately $25 million in 1945 currency, nearly $400 million in modern terms, and required 18 months of continuous construction employing thousands of specialized welders, engineers, and naval architects. The United States constructed 10 large auxiliary floating dry docks during the war, each capable of lifting battleships, and dozens of smaller variants for destroyers, submarines, and support vessels. But statistics, however impressive, could not convey the psychological impact of witnessing these structures in operation. Japanese engineers who survived the war and were later interviewed spoke of a peculiar despair that settled over them as they observed American naval operations in captured documents and intercepted photographs. They had been taught to believe, that Japanese spirit, Japanese dedication, Japanese willingness to sacrifice would compensate for any material disadvantage. This was the core mythology of Bushido applied to industrial warfare. That quality of spirit could overcome quantity of production. The floating dry docks demolished that mythology with the brutal efficiency of a wrecking ball. Commander Nakamura Hiroshi, a naval engineer who inspected captured American facilities after the war, recorded his impressions in a memoir published in 1952. His words carried the weight of professional devastation. We had been told that Americans were soft, that they lacked the discipline and spiritual strength necessary for total war. But when I walked through the captured floating dock at Subic Bay, I understood that we had confused comfort with weakness. The Americans had built a machine that could repair an Essex-class carrier in 17 days. We required 3 months to perform the same repairs at Kure Naval Arsenal, and that was before the bombing started. They had not defeated us through superior spirit. They had defeated us by making spirit irrelevant. The floating dry docks represented more than engineering achievement. They embodied a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare and national organization. Japanese military doctrine emphasized concentration of force at the decisive point, accepting enormous casualties and material sacrifice to achieve breakthrough. American doctrine emphasized sustainability and redundancy, building systems that could absorb damage and continue functioning. Where Japan built the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, a monument to concentrated firepower and national prestige, America built Essex-class carriers by the squadron, each individually less impressive than Yamato but collectively unstoppable. Where Japan concentrated repair facilities in the home islands, accepting that damaged ships faced perilous journeys back to Kure or Yokosuka, America distributed repair capacity across the Pacific, ensuring that damaged vessels could return to combat with minimal delay. This difference in philosophy extended beyond naval architecture into the very fabric of American industrial society. The floating dry docks were constructed not by slave labor or conscripted workforce, but by union welders earning premium wages for overtime shifts. They were designed not by militaristic engineers obsessed with perfection, but by pragmatic naval architects who understood that good enough to work was infinitely preferable to perfect, but too expensive to build. The United States had industrialized warfare in a manner that the Japanese, despite their own considerable industrial achievement, had never imagined possible. They had turned ship repair into an assembly line process, treated damaged vessels as problems to be solved rather than tragedies to be mourned. and created a logistics network so robust that individual losses became merely statistical adjustments rather than strategic catastrophes. The psychological impact on Japanese forces who encountered these facilities cannot be overstated. Survivors from the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, reported their shock at observing American ships they had damaged in previous battles returning to combat within weeks. Aircraft carriers that Japanese pilots swore they had crippled with torpedo strikes reappeared on reconnaissance photographs with fresh aircraft on their decks. Destroyers gutted by kamikaze strikes returned to radar picket duty with new superstructures. Even battleships, those massive symbols of naval power, could be resurrected from near destruction given enough time in an American floating dock. The symbolic object that represented this abundance, this casual dismissal of what Japanese forces considered catastrophic damage, was the welding rod. In Japanese shipyards, welding rods were carefully inventoried, their use monitored and rationed. Quality welding required skilled artisans who had trained for years, and the flux-coated electrodes themselves were precious commodities in a resource-starved empire. In American facilities, welding rods were consumed by the ton. Young women barely out of high school operated welding equipment with casual competence, their training measured in weeks rather than years. The floating dry docks themselves represented millions of pounds of welded seams, each joint inspected but rarely requiring correction. Each structural member fabricated with an efficiency that Japanese engineers found incomprehensible. Lieutenant Yamashita Kenji, a naval architect assigned to damage assessment after American raids, kept a private journal that survived the war. His entry from March 1945 captured the growing realization spreading through the Japanese naval establishment. Today, I reviewed reconnaissance photographs of Ulithi Atoll, 37 floating dry docks visible in the anchorage. 37. We have 4 in all of Japan and 2 are damaged from bombing. The Americans have built a complete naval infrastructure in a lagoon that did not appear on our charts 4 years ago.
They have not simply defeated us.
They have revealed that we were never truly in the same war. We were fighting with honor and sacrifice. They were fighting with factories and production schedules. This realization that industrial capacity could render courage obsolete represented a profound ideological crisis for the Japanese military mind. The entire structure of Japanese society had been reorganized around the premise that spiritual strength and willingness to die could compensate for material disadvantage. Kamikaze pilots flew to their deaths, believing that their sacrifice would make invasion of the home islands too costly for the Americans to contemplate. Japanese infantry on Pacific Islands fought to the last man, convinced that such displays of determination would break American will. Japanese submarine crews undertook suicide missions against American convoys, accepting certain death as the price of strategic impact. But the floating dry docks told a different story. They said, "Your sacrifice is noted and irrelevant." They said, "We can replace what you destroy faster than you can destroy it." They said, "This war is not a test of will but a test of systems, and your system has already failed." For every American ship damaged by kamikaze attack, 3 more emerged from American shipyards. For every American sailor killed, 10 more arrived on transport vessels. And behind those vessels stood the floating dry docks, ready to repair battle damage, refuel, rearm, and return ships to combat with mechanical efficiency that transformed warfare into an industrial process indistinguishable from manufacturing automobiles. The largest of the floating dry docks, the AFDB series, could accommodate battleships of the Iowa class, vessels displacing over 50,000 tons. To lift such ships, the docks employed a ballasting system of extraordinary sophistication. The dock would be deliberately flooded, submerging until its interior floor lay 50 feet beneath the surface. The damaged ship would be carefully maneuvered over the submerged dock, positioned with precision measured in inches. Then, slowly, compressed air would force water from the dock's ballast tanks, and the entire structure would begin to rise. The ship would emerge from the water like a whale breaching, its hull exposed for inspection and repair. The process took approximately 4 hours from submersion to full lift and represented a triumph of hydraulic engineering that Japanese naval architects studied with professional admiration and strategic despair. Once lifted, the ship became accessible in ways impossible at traditional dry docks. Scaffolding could be erected around the hull within hours. Work crews could access damage points from multiple angles simultaneously. Specialized equipment, welding generators, pneumatic rivet guns, steel plate cutters, could be positioned wherever needed. The interior of the floating dock became a factory floor, with different teams working on separate problems in parallel rather than sequence. A carrier might have its flight deck repaired by one crew, while another team replaced damaged catapult machinery and a third overhauled boiler systems. This parallelization of repair work, impossible at traditional docks with their limited access points, reduced repair time by factors of 2 or 3 compared to Japanese equivalents. The Americans had also solved the supply problem with characteristic excess. Each floating dock came with dedicated supply ships that carried everything from structural steel to toilet paper, from replacement armor plate to candy bars for the work crews. Japanese repair facilities struggled with chronic shortages of basic materials, quality steel, copper wire, replacement machinery. American floating docks operated in forward areas with supply chains so robust that running out of materials was considered a clerical error rather than an operational reality. This abundance extended to the workers themselves, well-fed, adequately rested, rotated through shifts that recognized human fatigue as an engineering problem to be solved through scheduling rather than endured through discipline. Japanese prisoners of war who worked in American facilities after their capture reported experiences that bordered on the surreal. They had been prepared for brutal treatment, perhaps execution. Instead, they found themselves assigned to work details supervised by bored petty officers who seemed more concerned with meeting production schedules than enforcing racial ideology. They received the same rations as American servicemen, rations that included fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and desserts in quantities that Japanese frontline troops had not seen since the early days of the war. They slept in barracks with mattresses and blankets. They had access to medical care that exceeded what was available to Japanese civilians in the home islands. And they worked alongside American personnel who treated ship repair as a job to be completed efficiently rather than a sacred duty to be performed with ritualistic precision. This casual competence, this treatment of extraordinary engineering, challenges as routine problems, represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the floating dry dock system. Japanese culture had elevated craftsmanship to an art form, imbued industrial production with spiritual significance, treated the construction of warships as acts of national devotion. American workers clocked in, did their jobs competently, and clocked out. They built floating dry docks the way they had built skyscrapers and hydroelectric dams and transcontinental railroads, as large-scale projects requiring organization and labor, certainly, but not requiring any particular mystical connection between worker and product. The docks worked not because Americans possessed superior spirit, but because they possessed superior systems for managing complexity. Commander Tanaka, still observing from his submarine's conning tower on that January morning, understood that he was witnessing the physical manifestation of Japan's strategic defeat. The invasion of Luzon had begun weeks earlier. American forces were pushing toward Manila with overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. Japanese defenders fought with suicidal courage, inflicted casualties, died by the thousands, and achieved nothing of strategic consequence. Because behind the American infantry division stood supply chains of staggering sophistication. Because damaged American tanks were repaired and returned to service while Japanese tanks, once damaged, became permanent losses. Because American wounded received penicillin and blood transfusions while Japanese wounded received morphine and bayonets. And because the American fleet, which sustained Japan's isolation and enabled the American advance, could repair its damaged vessels within sight of the combat zone, the submarine I-58 would survive until the final weeks of the war, eventually achieving fame as the vessel that sank the cruiser USS Indianapolis in July 1945. But Tanaka's observations in Manila Bay represented a more significant historical
moment than any individual sinking.
He had witnessed the material reality that Japanese propaganda could not disguise. The war was over, had been over since perhaps 1943, and was continuing only because Japanese leadership refused to acknowledge what their engineers and naval commanders already understood. The floating dry docks were not simply tools of war. They were tombstones marking the death of an ideology that believed spirit could defeat systems, courage could defeat logistics, and national determination could defeat industrial organization. In the final months of the war, as American forces prepared for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the floating dry dock fleet reached its maximum deployment. Facilities at Okinawa, Ulithi, Guam, and the Philippines operated around the clock, preparing the invasion fleet for the anticipated bloodbath. Japanese naval intelligence tracked this build-up with clinical precision, noting the arrival of each new dock section, each supply ship, each tender vessel. The numbers told a story of such
Overwhelming preparation that even the most fanatical
Japanese officer could not avoid the conclusion that American industrial power had grown beyond anything imaginable. In 1941, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ultimately made the invasion unnecessary, but the floating dry docks had already served their strategic purpose. They had sustained American naval power through 3 years of brutal combat. Across the largest ocean on Earth, they had transformed the Pacific from a defensive barrier protecting Japan into a highway for American power projection. And they had demonstrated to Japanese leadership and to the world that modern warfare had become industrialized to a degree that made traditional concepts of military valor increasingly irrelevant. After Japan's surrender, American forces occupied the home islands with massive logistical support, including floating dry docks towed directly to Japanese ports. Japanese civilians and former military personnel watched in stunned silence as American engineers established repair facilities in bombed-out harbors, not by rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure, but by simply positioning floating docks and connecting them to portable power generators and water supplies. What would have taken Japanese engineers years to reconstruct was accomplished by Americans in weeks. The message was clear, though unspoken. American abundance was not a temporary advantage, but a permanent condition, the product of an economic and political system that generated wealth and capability far beyond what militaristic societies could achieve through force and sacrifice. Nakamura, the naval engineer who had inspected captured American facilities, wrote a final reflection in his memoir that captured the transformation of consciousness forced upon Japanese technical personnel. We had been educated to believe that Western democracy made nations weak, that free societies lacked the discipline necessary for total war. The floating dry docks taught us that we had confused democracy with disorder. The Americans had built these structures not through military conscription, but through private enterprise, not through obedience, but through cooperation, not through sacrifice, but through prosperity. Their workers built them because they were well paid. Their engineers designed them because they were professionally rewarded. Their system produced abundance, not in spite of freedom, but because of it. This was the lesson that destroyed the ideological foundation of our war, that human beings, given freedom and opportunity, would create more than human beings driven by force and fear. We had bet our nation's survival on the opposite premise. We lost not just a war, but an argument about human nature itself. The floating dry docks remained in service long after the war, many continuing operation through the Korean and Vietnam conflicts. Some were eventually sunk as artificial reefs, others were scrapped, their massive steel sections cut up and recycled. A few remain in service today, antiquated by modern standards but still functional, monuments to an era when American industrial might seemed limitless and the transformation of military logistics revolutionized the nature of warfare. The symbolic weight of these structures extended beyond their technical achievement. They represented the industrialization of recovery itself, the idea that destruction could be treated as a temporary setback rather than a permanent loss. In a larger sense, they embodied the American approach to existence, that problems were to be solved through abundance rather than endured through sacrifice, that systems properly designed could eliminate the need for heroism, that prosperity was a strategic asset more valuable than any weapon. The Japanese had built the Yamato and seen it sunk. The Americans had built floating dry docks and changed the nature of naval warfare forever. In the decades after the war, historians and economists studied the industrial production that enabled Allied victory, and the floating dry docks emerged as case studies in the advantages of democratic capitalism. They had been designed by private engineering firms competing for contracts, built by unionized workers earning middle-class wages, and deployed by a military that understood logistics as the foundation of combat power. No authoritarian system had produced anything comparable. The Soviet Union, despite massive industrial capacity, never developed equivalent facilities. Nazi Germany, for all its engineering prowess, built fixed fortifications and superweapons rather than flexible logistics systems. Imperial Japan concentrated resources on prestige, projects and offensive capabilities, while neglecting the unsexy work of supply chain management. The contrast revealed fundamental differences in how societies organize productive capacity. Democratic systems, with their emphasis on individual initiative and decentralized decision-making, proved superior at managing complexity. The floating dry docks required coordination among steel mills, fabrication shops, transport networks, and naval architects. Coordination achieved not through central planning, but through market mechanisms and professional expertise. Authoritarian systems excelled at concentrated effort towards single objectives, but struggled with the kind of distributed problem-solving required for projects spanning multiple industries and thousands of individual decisions. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka survived the war, returned to Japan, and eventually worked as a civilian maritime engineer during the post-war reconstruction. He never published his observations from Manila Bay, but his private papers, discovered after his death in 1984, included a note written in English, a language he had learned from American occupation personnel. The note was brief. "We thought we were fighting for honor. They were fighting with systems. Systems won. Systems always win." That conclusion, stark and unadorned, captured what the floating dry docks symbolized in the broader narrative of the Pacific War. They represented the triumph of prosaic efficiency over romantic sacrifice, of industrial organization over military valor, of abundance over scarcity. They proved that wars between industrial nations are won not by soldiers willing to die, but by societies capable of producing, supplying, and sustaining military forces over years of continuous combat. They demonstrated that freedom and prosperity, far from weakening a nation's military capacity, provided the foundation for military power that authoritarian systems could not match. The floating dry docks no longer prowl the Pacific. Their massive hulls no longer lift damaged warships from tropical waters. But their legacy persists in every aspect of modern military logistics, in the understanding that sustainable combat power requires sustainable supply chains, in the recognition that the warehouse is as strategically important as the warship. They taught a lesson written in steel and welding rod and hydraulic systems, that the true measure of national power is not the willingness of citizens to die for their country, but the ability of their country to keep them alive, supplied, and fighting until victory is achieved through sheer, inexorable material superiority. In the end, the floating dry docks were more than engineering marvels. They were arguments made in metal, testaments to a philosophy of abundance over scarcity, proof that democratic societies at war possessed advantages that militaristic societies could not replicate through discipline or sacrifice. They helped win a war. They helped end an empire. And they stood as monuments to a simple truth that Lieutenant Commander Tanaka recognized in Manila Bay on that grey January morning. That in industrial warfare, prosperity is destiny and abundance is the ultimate weapon.